The fog hadn't begun as a natural part of the morning. It was like a curtain, as if a hand had deliberately drawn it over Western Poland, and behind that curtain, the heaviest pride of the Middle Ages, the chivalric order propped up by armor, lineage, and blessing, was marching forward without seeing its own end. 3 days in April, 1241 would become a breaking point, not only for an army, but for a faith. What Europe believed was invincible would crack with the first blow and carve itself into memory like a wound that would ache for centuries. The Mongols were no longer a rumor. They had arrived. But to understand this scene, you first have to erase the caricature drawn by fear. The Mongols were not the shadow European scribes would later describe as mindless savages. They were the continuation of the war system Genghis Khan built, a conquest engine that worked with discipline, thought with speed, and stretched from the Pacific to the threshold of Europe in less than 2 generations. Every Mongol warrior practically grew up in the saddle. He learned to ride before his walking was even steady. He could hit a target at full gallop, survive for weeks on mare's milk and dried meat, and march in ways that made what European armies called distance meaningless. By 1241, the Mongol Empire reached from China's coast to Europe's doorstep. The mighty cities of Central Asia had fallen. The great powers of the Islamic world had been broken. Even the Great Wall of China, supposedly a barrier against the north, had failed catastrophically. Now, under the leadership of Batu Khan, Genghis's grandson, 3 Teutons, about 30,000 men, a force drawn from the most efficient soldiers on earth, had already obliterated Kiev, the jewel of Rus, and burned through Hungary like wildfire. This advance was not random plunder. It was a meticulously planned campaign. Batu Khan split his forces. While one army devastated Hungary, another wing marched into Poland, eliminating any possible threat to the flanks. Lublin had been burned. Sandomierz had been sacked. Kalisz had been reduced to glowing ruin. The next target, Silesia, one of Poland's richest duchies. Duke Henry II of Silesia, known as Henry the Pious for his deep faith, knew what was coming. He was not naive. Reports had poured in from the east. Cities turned to ash in a day. Populations cut down to the last soul. Veteran armies erased in hours. Witnesses spoke of them as devils on horseback, warriors who appeared out of nowhere and vanished like ghosts. Henry refused to run. He was an experienced commander, and if the Mongols were not stopped here, the road into Europe would be wide open. He sent desperate calls to Poland, Moravia, and the German states. The response was both heartening and unsettling. The Knights Templar, legendary veterans of the Crusades, answered. The Teutonic Knights rode down from the Baltic, heavy cavalry in black and white. Polish nobles set aside their feuds and gathered their men. Duke Mieszko of Opole came with his entire host. Moravian infantry marched north. Even Silesian miners, men who had never seen war, took up arms to defend their faith. Panicked chronicles would later claim 100,000 men gathered against the Mongols. Modern historians comparing logistics and population records give a more realistic range, between 25,000 and 40,000. Even so, it was one of the largest European forces of the Middle Ages. For perspective, William the Conqueror took England with 10,000 men. Even the biggest crusader armies rarely exceeded 30,000. Facing them were roughly 20,000 Mongols, 2 Teutons under Baidar and Khadan. The Europeans had the numbers. They wore heavier armor, carried superior steel, and marched with the Pope's blessing. They believed God was with them. They were about to learn that it wasn't enough. The grandchildren of Genghis, Batu Khan and Khadan, son of Ogadei, were not wild men. They were masters of strategy. Men raised from birth inside a science of war. The Mongols had studied European warfare for years, through spies disguised as merchants. They knew every strength and every weakness of their enemy. The European knight was the tank of his age, a mountain of man, horse, and steel. a shock force that could smash infantry lines. But the Mongols saw the flaws. Knights were slow, horses tired quickly. Hunger for glory made them reckless. Most of all, their greatest strength was close combat. Mongol war, by contrast, was built on killing you before you could ever reach them. April 7th, 1241. Day 1. The European army advanced in the traditional formation out of Legnica, a sight that could make the medieval world tremble. Heavy cavalry in the center, knights in chain and early plate, helmets glittering in the sun, lances raised. Each suit of armor was worth a village's yearly income. War horses, massive destriers bred for power, snorted and pawed at the earth, ready to charge. On the flanks marched Polish spearmen, Moravian crossbowmen, and Silesian miners who had turned crude tools into weapons. Priests moved between the ranks, blessing them, granting absolution. Banners snapped in the wind. The Teutonic Order's black cross, the Templars' red, Poland's white eagle. The united strength of Christian Europe looked like it had become flesh. Then dust appeared on the horizon, but not the heavy dust of a marching host, something lighter, restless, a strange haze sliding with unnatural speed. The first Mongol scouts emerged, small silhouettes on small, agile horses. The knights laughed. These are the Mongols? Men on half-sized mounts could be crushed in a single charge. The Mongols drew closer, but not too close. They entered bow range and stopped far beyond anything the Europeans could answer. The Mongol composite bow, layers of horn, sinew, and wood, could deliver lethal accuracy beyond 350 meters, at distances no European crossbow could reach. The riders loosed their arrows into the sky, then wheeled their horses and vanished at speed. "Cowards!" the Polish knights shouted, running like rabbits, like women. But the flight was the plan, not fear. Doctrine. For hours, Mongol horse archers shredded the European lines. They galloped in, rained arrows, withdrew before the heavy cavalry could respond. Each warrior carried around 60 arrows. Pack horses behind them brought hundreds more. 20,000 men times 60 arrows, more than 1,000,000 arrows. The mathematics of death. The Europeans raised shields and endured, but mentally they were breaking. These knights had trained their entire lives for glorious charges and sword-to-sword victory, not to bleed helplessly under an enemy they could not touch. Arrows found gaps in armor and horses screamed. Men pierced at the joints cursed God. Unarmored infantry paid the heaviest price. Duke Henry ordered the crossbowmen to return fire. But by the time they set their weapons and aimed, the Mongols had already drifted out of range. The Templars begged to charge. Henry refused. This was what the Mongols wanted: the collapse of discipline, a frantic chase after ghosts, death in fragments. But holding position and being slowly peeled apart was its own kind of death for morale. By sunset, the true horror of Mongol war had revealed itself. This would not be an honorable duel. This would be systematic erasure. When night fell, hundreds of Europeans lay dead or moaning on the ground. Some horses had to be killed to end their suffering. The camp was filled with the screams of the wounded. Mongol losses were perhaps a dozen, a few lucky crossbow bolts. The Mongols camped just beyond sight as darkness came. Signal fires dotted the horizon like fallen stars. And then, the drums began. A deep, rolling thunder spilling into the night, hammering exhausted European nerves, stealing sleep from their bodies. Day 2. April 8th, 1241. Dawn burned the sky blood red, an omen even priests struggled to ignore. The Europeans reformed their ranks sleepless and shaken. Many of the wounded had died during the night. Arguments flared among commanders. Polish nobles bickered with the Templars, while the Teutonic knights demanded an immediate attack. Duke Mieszko of Opole threatened to withdraw entirely if they kept waiting to be butchered like cattle. Henry realized something had to change. When Mongol riders began their harassment again that morning, he made a critical decision. He ordered Duke Mieszko to send forward a partial cavalry force. Not the whole army, just enough to scatter the horse archers, maybe catch a few and interrogate them. 2,000 of Poland's best knights surged forward. The earth shook. Lances dropped, shields locked. A storm of steel and muscle roared across the plains. The Mongol light cavalry seemed to panic. They turned and fled. The Polish knights screamed in triumph. They had been humiliated for a day. Now revenge seemed to be coming. "We've got them," Mieszko shouted. "Press on! For the glory of Christ, kill them all." The pursuit lasted for miles, but the Mongols always stayed just out of reach, occasionally turning to loose a few arrows, drawing the chase deeper. Some Polish nobles sensed the danger, but Mieszko, blinded by rage and pride, drove his men farther and farther forward. This was exactly what the Mongols wanted. The feigned retreat, the masterpiece of Mongol war, was working perfectly. As the knights spread across the plain, as their tight formation thinned, the trap closed. From hidden slopes and hollows, Mongol heavy cavalry, yes, they had heavy units too, appeared suddenly. At the same time, light horsemen who had been circling unseen slammed in from every direction. Mieszko understood his mistake too late. His men were surrounded, cut off from Henry's main force, trapped on open ground where heavy armor was not an advantage. What followed was not battle. It was slaughter. The Mongols did not duel for honor. They killed like a machine. They rode in circles around the trapped knights, pouring volley after volley into the mass of men and horses. When Europeans tried to charge, they met coordinated counterattacks. When they held position, arrows fell without mercy. Only after the survivors weakened and cracked did Mongol heavy cavalry move in to deliver the final blow. Duke Mieszko fought bravely. Legends claim he personally brought down a dozen Mongols before 5 arrows pierced his body. His guard made a last stand around him, singing hymns as they died. The outcome was inevitable. Of the 2,000 knights who charged that morning, fewer than 200 returned. The ones who came back were shattered, some wounded, some mentally collapsed. They spoke of the silent, merciless devil riders who fought as if guided by a single mind. One knight, his armor riddled with 7 arrow holes, died that night whispering, "They're not human. They're not human." That night, the Mongols sent Henry's camp a message of terror. Duke Mieszko's severed head, packed in salt. Beside it was a single sentence, written in broken Latin. Tomorrow. Day 3. April 9th, 1241. The day of annihilation. Henry's war council that morning was near hysteria. Almost a quarter of his army was gone. Moravian infantry hovered on the edge of mutiny. Some Polish nobles had fled under cover of darkness with their attendants. Retreat was impossible. Henry knew the Mongols would hunt them across the plains like prey and cut them down one by one. Only one option remained: stand and fight no matter the cost. They chose the battlefield carefully. They would fight at Legnica Pole, the Legnica Plain. A slight rise gave their archers range, and a stream protected one flank from encirclement. Henry formed his forces in a defensive line. In the center stood the Templars and Teutonic knights, men sworn to fight to the death. The right wing was held by Polish cavalry, the left by the remaining infantry. Henry kept a small reserve hidden in the rear. When the fog lifted, the Mongols appeared once again, but something was different. They were not deployed in their usual wide crescent. Instead, they seemed to be setting up strange devices, like large cauldrons mounted on wooden carts. The Europeans watched in confusion. Cooking? A pagan ritual? Then the battle began, and the true shape of terror emerged. These cauldrons were Chinese smoke-producing devices. Gunpowder smoke, not cannon. cannons would not appear in Europe for decades. The Mongols had learned this technology in campaigns against the Jin dynasty in northern China. As Henry's army advanced, the Mongols fired the devices. Thick, choking black smoke spread over the field, rolling into the European ranks like a living fog. Within minutes, order collapsed. Men could not see more than a few steps ahead. Commands vanished in coughing and panic. Units separated. Banners disappeared inside the smoke. And with them, coordination. Knights tangled into their own infantry. Horses reared and screamed, blinded and terrified. Then came the Mongols' most insidious move. Days earlier, they had captured Polish prisoners and learned a single sentence in Polish. Wszyscy straceni. All is lost. Now, inside the choking fog, Mongol warriors shouted the words in perfect imitation. Unable to see who was speaking, Polish soldiers believed familiar voices were telling them to retreat. Panic spread faster than smoke. Men began to run, crashing into comrades still holding the line, dragging them with them. The left-wing infantry was the first to break. That collapse exposed the center. The Templars and Teutons were now isolated inside a vast chaos. At that moment, the Mongols struck with horrifying precision. How they maintained such coordination inside the smoke is still a mystery. Perhaps the drums, perhaps low horns carrying through the fog. Perhaps simply that each man knew his role so perfectly they moved like parts of a single organism. Mongol light cavalry surged into the flanks, raining arrows into the confused mass. Heavy cavalry smashed into weakening clusters, tearing through them. The Knights Templar fought with the faith of men who believed martyrdom was waiting. Surrounded, outnumbered, half-blinded, they formed a circle and fought until not one remained. Their Grand Master was later found with 23 arrows in his body, his sword broken, lying among piles of Mongol dead. The Teutonic knights formed a wedge to punch through the smoke and charged blindly. For a brief moment they broke the Mongol line. Then, out in open ground, they were pursued by horse archers. One by one, they fell. Their heavy armor was no longer salvation, but sentence. When exhausted horses collapsed beneath them, they became steel statues that could not move. In the rear, Duke Henry saw the disaster and seized a last desperate chance. He raised his personal banner and rode forward, trying to rally what remained. For a moment, it seemed to work. Scattered knights began to gather toward him. Then a single arrow from an unknown Mongol archer found its mark, striking Henry under the arm, where armor plates met. He staggered, but did not fall. He was still swinging his sword. His guards tried to shield him, but the Mongols had seen the banner. They focused everything on that point. Henry's men were cut down one by one. At last, bleeding out, the Duke fell from his horse. When the army saw him fall, the final resistance collapsed. The line turned into flight, and flight turned into massacre. The Mongols chased the fleeing men for miles, cutting them down as they ran. Knights tore off their armor to run faster. Proud nobles begged for mercy in languages their killers did not understand, did not care about. Henry was found alive, but dying. By traditions that honored brave enemies, Mongol commanders offered him a quick death. Henry refused. He said he would die as a Christian knight, as he had lived. They did not spare him. They severed his head and carried it through Legnica on a spear as proof of victory. Days later, his mother searched the field among the corpses. She recognized him only by the 6th toe on his left foot. By noon, it was over. The scale of the destruction was beyond comprehension. As was their custom, the Mongols cut off the right ear of every enemy to count the dead. They filled 9 large leather sacks. Chronicles claim between 10,000 and 25,000 Europeans lay in the field. The Silesian nobility had been nearly erased. The Templars and Teutons suffered losses so severe it took a generation to rebuild their numbers. Dynasties that had ruled for centuries were scraped out of history in a single morning. Modern historians estimate Mongol losses at under 700, most of them among the heavy units leading the final assaults. The field was like hell. Bodies lay so thick you could walk for hundreds of meters without stepping on soil. Carrion birds darkened the sky, circling so densely they blotted out the sun. The stench of death traveled for miles. For years, local farmers would find bones in their fields. In just 3 days, a smaller Mongol force had annihilated one of the largest European armies of the Middle Ages. But the Battle of Legnica was not only a military disaster, it was psychological collapse. It shattered Europe's sense of invincibility and bent the course of history. News spread across the continent like fire. In Paris, King Louis IX ordered new fortifications and reorganized his army with updated tactics. In Rome, Pope Gregory IX called for a new crusade, not to the Holy Land but to defend Europe itself from the devil's horsemen. Even Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, long locked in conflict with the papacy, suddenly became more open to peace in the face of this external nightmare. Letters from the period show how deep the fear ran. A German chronicler wrote, "The Mongols are God's punishment for our sins. They do not fight like men of honor, but like devils who battle with deceit and savagery. The best knights of Christendom were like children before them." The shock was not limited to losses. The Mongols had proven that the foundation of European power, the armored knight, no longer worked against a disciplined, tactically superior enemy. Chivalric ideals, individual heroism, honor in battle, meant nothing against a system of strategy and coordination. Europe's salvation came from an unexpected turn. In December 1241, only 8 months after Legnica, Great Khan Ogedei died in Mongolia. Some sources say he drank himself to death. Others mention the possibility of poisoning. Under Mongol law, every prince of Genghis's line had to return for the election of the new Great Khan. Batu Khan obeyed, even though it meant abandoning the conquest. The armies withdrew, and Europe exhaled. The Mongols never pushed this far west again. Internal conflicts, vast distances, and the empire's fragmentation prevented a return. But the memory of the defeat was burned into Europe's collective mind with fire and blood. Legnica forced a revolution in military thought. Within a generation, European armies shifted toward combined arms tactics, strengthened archery, began experimenting with early gunpowder weapons. The slow death of the age of mounted knightly supremacy had begun. Feudal levies would give way to professional armies. Discipline and coordination would matter more than noble courage. Some historians even say Legnica saved Europe because it forced these changes early. 2 centuries later, when the Ottoman Turks, heirs to Mongol military traditions, advanced into Europe, the continent was better prepared. Not with scattered knights, but with organized armies, firearms, and strategy born from the bitter lessons learned on that blood-soaked Silesian plain. Today, the Battle of Legnica is remembered differently in different countries. In Poland, it is both tragedy and pride, proof that their ancestors stood against an impossible force. In Mongolia, it is seen as one of history's brightest tactical victories, studied as a textbook example of discipline and strategy over numbers and technology. The battlefield itself is now a quiet stretch of farmland. A modest monument marks where Duke Henry is believed to have fallen. Every year on April 9th, reenactors gather there in chainmail and clash with replica weapons. But no reenactment can capture the true terror of that smoke-choked morning. The moment the medieval world order collapsed on the plains of Silesia. The echo of Mongol hooves still sounds inside history. A chilling reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to sudden collapse. At Legnica, the Mongols did not only defeat an army, they destroyed a worldview. They closed an era and forced a civilization to evolve, or to die. All in 3 days. 3 days that changed the world forever.